The election of Pope Francis in 2013 was a turning point in the history of the post conciliar church. And this was true before he'd published a single document, before he'd given a single interview, before he even stepped out on the loggia to wave at the world. You see, Jorge Bergoglio was ordained into the priesthood on December 13th, 1969, making him our first pope who was ordained into the Reformed rites of ordination and thus had no experience saying the traditional Latin Mass. Though prior to ordination, he certainly served at the Old Mass, but he had no experience saying it as a priest. His successor, Pope Leo, was ordained in 1982 and is thus even further removed from any priestly experience of the traditional Mass. By contrast, John Paul II spent 23 years as a priest saying the traditional Latin Mass, and Benedict XVI a full 18 years. While JP2 and Benedict enjoyed decades of priestly formation under the traditional rites, Francis and Leo's exposure to it was much sparser. Now, Francis at least spent some years in minor orders serving the Old Mass. Leo's only serving experience was as an altar boy, a role he held at his primary school from 1961 on. But Leo was only 14 when the Novus Ordo was promulgated, so almost the entirety of his Catholic life has been spent in the Pauline rites. And whoever succeeds Leo as Pope will likely have had no formative experiences with the traditional Latin Mass whatsoever, except perhaps as something rediscovered as an adult. But the days of popes having been raised with and formed under the traditional Mass are over. Now, obviously, there were progressives before the council and there are progressives after the council. Being raised with the traditional Mass isn't some kind of antidote against novelty. And John Paul II and Benedict XVI both had their problems. But still, I think this does make a difference in the assumptions and intellectual framework a man carries over into the papacy. Their faults notwithstanding, John Paul II and Benedict XVI were clearly corrective popes. They understood that the pendulum had swung too far after the council, and they were interested in nudging the church back to some sense of normalcy. John Paul II viewed this as a philosophical challenge to be addressed by infusing the church with personalist ethics and a Christocentric humanism. Benedict, on the other hand, tended to see the church's fundamental problem as liturgical, best addressed by a rediscovery of the church's liturgical heritage. There are, of course, problems with how each man carried out his programs. I think the visions of JP2 and Benedict, well intentioned though they were, reflected a kind of liberal naivete, the idea that it was sufficient to simply lead by example and let truth triumph in the free marketplace of ideas. Though there's much that can be critiqued about the approaches of John Paul and Benedict, we can't deny that they thought the church needed a correction and that they believed they were contributing to that correction, hoping to push that post conciliar pendulum back towards the center. Despite their shortcomings, they seem to have retained a basic understanding that the Catholic faith was something that was given, something heritable that needed to be preserved in order for it to retain its potency. And they used the means they thought best to address this imbalance. And to a large degree, I believe this wholesome intuition was formed in them during those formative years serving as priests under the traditional rites. Now, with Francis, things were quite different. Whereas JP2 and Benedict were trying to course correct toward the center, Francis believed the conciliar vision had not gone far enough. JP2 and Benedict wanted to reinforce the faith with some kind of structure, where for Francis, traditional structures were deconstructed, hollowed out, and turned malleable in the service of the god of surprises. For Francis and his clique, the only bedrock of certainty was the will of the Pope himself. It was a profoundly Peronist view of the church, a bizarre mixture of Francis's Jesuitical and Argentinian background, in which the church is essentially whatever the Pope says it is. Tradition for Francis was an abstraction, not a concrete body of beliefs and practices. Now, Leo is of a different metal than Francis, and I find the characterizations of Leo as Francis 2.0 to be inaccurate, a sloppy label applied by people unable to think beyond the dichotomy of good pope, bad pope. Leo appears to value not rocking the boat above everything else, and perhaps to a fault. He's hardly the chaos agent that Francis was. In fact, I suspect he deliberately avoids the bombastic tendencies of his predecessor. Even so, Leo too at times seems to speak of the church as something more malleable. He wants order, he wants structure, he wants dignity, but he's okay drawing that order out of novelty. In his recent comments on the liturgy, Leo made the following statement, quote, "We are well aware that liturgical formation is one of the main themes of the entire conciliar and post-conciliar journey." Journey, blech. Anyway, while much progress has been made, there's still a long way to go. Let us not tire. Let us enthusiastically resume the good initiatives inspired by the reform and, at the same time, seek new ways and new methods. Now, this video is not to dump on Leo by any means. I'm using Leo as an example of how the papacy is evolving as we move further from the terminal point of 1969. Whereas John Paul and Benedict spoke of the conciliar reform from a place of personal experience and bitter disappointment, this is not the case for Leo. Leo was only 7 years old when Vatican II was convened. Leo calls for new ways and new methods. This is the default for a man of his generation and formation, a man whose clerical experience has been nothing but new ways and new methods. Of course, there's still a long way to go because the post conciliar journey never takes you anywhere. In short, Leo seems to have the same naivete as JP2 and Benedict, but without the corresponding formation in the church's traditional rites. And I think it was specifically that formation in the old rites that kept JP2 and Benedict more grounded, more reliably centrist, with even occasional expressions of genuine traditional sentiment. They were more keenly aware of the givenness of the faith. While Francis was almost certainly more radical than Leo in his ideas, Leo's formation offered him even less exposure to the traditional rites than Francis. Consider that Leo entered seminary in 1977 and was ordained in 1982, a period many consider the absolute nadir of the post conciliar epoch. His entire clerical career has witnessed nothing but novelty after novelty. Now, I do not in any way suggest this is an insurmountable handicap. People are not static entities. I run a trad website and YouTube channel, but back in 2002, I was strumming guitar at Mass. So, yeah, people can change. And the grace of the Petrine office is a real thing. And as I said, Leo seems motivated above all by a desire for stability and has so far demonstrated a laudable tendency to let his personality disappear into the background so the office can shine, something Francis could never do. I believe Leo is a man of goodwill who genuinely wants to do good for the church, but I also believe his conceptual framework for what constitutes that good and how to achieve it has been deeply conditioned by his clerical formation and experiences. What this means for the church remains to be seen, but the point is that we have crossed a line into a new age of the papacy, where our future popes will have no meaningful experience of the church before the council, or even the council itself for that matter. Popes will less and less fit the mold of either the paternalistic conservative of JP2 and Benedict or the authoritarian progressive of Francis. In the short term, I suspect they will be less ideological and more pragmatic, for good and for ill. This may mean less of the erraticism that characterized Francis, but it will also mean less of the cohesive, integrated vision that characterized Benedict. Our next popes may increasingly resemble your average diocesan parish priest, good natured but adrift, hardworking but a bit undirected, valuing concord but without clarity of vision. And such may be the state of things until the times and seasons are changed and the Holy Ghost causes a spirit of renewal to settle upon the Church of Christ.